I loved this conversation. This is simply one of the best conversations you'll ever hear as relates to the gym and weightlifting and philosophy. Now, if you're not interested in the gym and weightlifting, this applies to what we're going to say applies to a lot of embodied practice. And this guy's a real scholar. So he's quoting Socrates and Plato, all the sort of Greek classics, stuff around embodiment, the influence of Christianity on embodiment. It's also just a really good conversation. Some guests, they come on and they just want to give a spiel. Other guests come on and they're like, no, 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 I want to talk with you, not at you, which I appreciate, particularly when it's a topic like this that I'm, fairly deep in. And I hope listeners don't mind. I think it makes for a better listen when it's a real conversation like this. There's almost no conversations about this exact topic on the internet, to be honest. But I think if you're interested in embodiment at all, then the philosophy and the kind of history of that is going to be interesting. Okay, on the show today, Joe Lombardo. So Joe is the editor of Ultra Physical, which to me hosts some of the some of the best writing on fitness on the internet, some of the most interesting stuff. As listeners may know, if they're following my socials, I've got kind of very interested in the sort of deeper philosophical side of strength training and working out. And a few months ago, someone sent me the one podcast you can find of Joe talking about this in terms of Greek philosophy and Christianity and all kinds of deep approaches to strength training. And I've actually listened to that episode several times, and I thought I've got to get him on the show. So, Joe, you are very, very welcome.
Mark, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So strength enthusiast, writer, how did you get it into what you do now? Let's hear a little bit about your life story.
Yeah, sure. No, I appreciate you having me on the show. And I'm a very normal, average guy. I grew up in a suburb outside of New York City. My family's mostly from New York, parts of another state called Pennsylvania. Pretty easygoing childhood, no crazy hardships or struggles, was always sort of an active kid. Wasn't really big on the whole team sport thing. I kind of like to, do stuff more on my own. And yeah, for me, physical fitness and writing and those kind of that sort of confluence of interest that really developed much later. I'm 40 now, and I'd say it really started more in my early to mid 30s. I had always been pretty active, up through probably about college. Once I finished college, went to grad school and worked and all that, I just really stopped taking care of my body, to be quite frank, and just did a lot of time, doing my research for my PhD. And after a while, I just realized that I felt very much out of sync with, my fitness, my body, I suppose. I always think back to when I was in high school or even in college, you're able to kind of, drink yourself silly in college, and then you're able to like, wake up the next morning and, play sports or run or lift or do whatever. And obviously once you get into your 30s, that becomes a little bit tougher. The lower back starts to kind of yell at you a little bit more. You definitely feel a little bit more sluggish and tired. And at that point, I didn't want to just sort of blame age, right? I didn't want to go down that road of, well, maybe this is just what happens to men. We just sort of obligate ourselves into decrepitude after the age of 35. And not wanting to do that, I decided to really look into strength training primarily, barbell work, that kind of stuff. And that really dovetailed into my sort of pre-existing interest in theory and philosophy and that sort. And it just sort of began to reflect more on what this all means. What is lifting just simply lifting? Is it a hobby? And then I go back to my normal work, and I felt like there was a lot of character building involved when you start lifting and fitness in general. So I wanted to kind of marry the two together, if you will. And I did have a podcast, oh gosh, a couple of years ago. We went from 2018 to 2021. It might still be available, called Scholars in Iron. And that was my first attempt into talking mostly to powerlifters and some Olympic weightlifters about, philosophy, politics, maybe a little theology. A little documentary came out of it, Women in Powerlifting, that I did with a close childhood friend of mine. It's free on, I think on YouTube. It's like 24 minutes or something. And so I wanted to kind of explore these philosophical and social facets of fitness. One thing, or kind of one of the impetuses too, was because I felt like in the fitness world, and Mark, I'm sure you recognize as probably being a lot more involved in it than I was or than I am. You either have kind of your bro aphorisms,
Mm,
like
yeah.
your Stoics, your Nietzsche, right? And on the other hand, it's kind of like your more like wellness types, like, oh, feel good about your body. And it's a little bit more lighter, it's a little bit more cuddly. And I just felt like both were interesting to an extent, but it wasn't, I wanted something a little bit more with depth, right? And
Mm.
so I teamed up with Dan Kunitz, who's a Olympic weightlifter himself and a Wall Street journalist, writer, author. And so we just figured, we should really just start writing about this. And that's kind of how Ultra Physical came about. We're about to celebrate our 1 year anniversary on July 12th of this year. So
Fantastic. Let's look at this. I want to come back to character development later on, but let's kind of go through the philosophers and the relevant theory and background. I guess the sort of in Western culture, the people who are most associated with physical culture, though perhaps some of the stereotypes aren't accurate, are the Greeks. Yeah, it seems to me the Greeks have quite at times ambivalent relationship to the body. Like on one hand, loving the body, but certainly a depth approach to the gymnasia that we wouldn't necessarily recognize today. But on the other hand, there are some antibody trends in the Greeks. How would you sort of summarize the ancient Greeks' attitude towards the body?
yeah, we can start kind of backwards. So like once Plato and Socrates and sort of had left the scene, you have the Neoplatonics, so Plotinus, folks like him. Plotinus was someone who really was much more kind of a headier intellectual, and he really saw Phaedo, which is the last Socratic dialogue of Socrates, recorded by Plato, as kind of like the definitive Socratic or Platonic attitude towards the body. Like the body just sort of sucks. It always leads you into like eating more or just having crazy sex or whatever, like all the kind of vices that
Mm,
we'd associate with the body is slovenly, right? So that moment from Plotinus, who's kind of like sort of seen as like the core key figure of the Neoplatonists, really stamps right the Greek legacy with that kind of antibody notions that you get. Now that said, uh, if you go through the Republic or Theaetetus or other dialogues and writings of Plato, you do see the emergence of the role of the body, right? And it's really comes down to kind of training the soul or training one's virtue, that the body is sort of the enfleshed virtues that you would present to other people. And that it does require a certain amount of character building. That the body is always going to play second fiddle to the soul. It's just not as important, but it's still important. So I think for academics, for reasons maybe unknown to me sometimes, they tend to kind of see Plato as like very dismissive, or Socrates is very dismissive of that. But really, when you kind of look at it deeper, there is a role for the body. They often just call it physical training. But even sport itself is sort of thrown in there as something that defines one's aptitude for courage, defines one's aptitude for defending one's homeland or the family, or to spur bravery, right? All these kinds of like
mm,
classic noble ideas that might seem a little bit silly to talk about these days, it seems, but that was really the proper role of having kind of a good conditioned body. And also lastly, the body was one part, right, of sort of the Greek obsession with moderation, with temperance, right? Like
mm,
you don't overtrain the body to the point where it begins to destroy other virtues or characters that you have. It shouldn't, supplant your quest for knowledge and wisdom, which is like the ultimate form of good. But it's supposed to be part of like that kind of like a balanced life, if you will. And then the body needs to be brought into its sort of proper measure along with your fascination in, I don't know, astronomy or mathematics and such like that.
yeah, my sense was perhaps the Greeks also had took a lot for granted, and Socrates was a soldier, Plato was a wrestler, and there was probably quite a lot taken for granted in terms of course, you develop yourself through the body. There was um, an obviousness to that makes it kind of invisible, perhaps.
Yeah, we'll say more. I mean, I'm curious to hear what you think. I mean, I sometimes have conversations with myself. I don't have too many people to talk about this subject. So what strikes you about the Greeks in fitness?
It is a huge pleasure actually to be able to have a conversation about this because so much out there on the body is either sort of gym bros or kind of low level new age motivational stuff.
Right.
And people who train seriously, like I was in the gym for 2 hours this morning, getting it pretty hard, and think seriously about it. It's quite rare. So I just want to sort of flag that this is quite a sweet pleasure for me and well worth doing on a Sunday where I wouldn't normally do a podcast. But yeah, so I definitely see a couple of different trends. What I'm very interested in is the idea of character development. So I've studied Japanese martial arts quite intensely, and I know Mishima as well. Maybe we'll come to him. And in the sort of Budo idea, to develop oneself, one's spirit, the Japanese would say that that word is a translation of a Japanese word that's hard to translate. Is sort of obvious, and every Japanese school child does martial arts for this reason, even though it's a very safe country. There's no practical reason to do it. But they see it as just integral to their education from the samurai up to this day. And the British public school system that invented most of the sports that are played globally, football and rugby and things like that. Obviously, the Americans, ruined them with offshoots, but with the exception and basketball in modern times, of course, that idea of sort of educating people's character through the body is a British idea that it got lost, I think, in the last 100 years, and then almost certainly that started with the Greeks. Yeah, I'd love to hear your views on character development through embodied practice.
Yeah, well, if I don't actually, I kind of want to pick your brain a little bit more, Mark, if you don't mind.
Yes, sure. I want
I
to
was
go on.
No, I was just sort of curious about the Japanese concept of sport. I mean, you mentioned Budo and this kind of, I guess, is it more of like an ethos or an ethic? Like, how would that compare to what like you and I would know about, let's say, the Greek understanding of fitness?
I think it's pretty aligned.
Okay.
I'm in some ways more familiar with the Japanese, and it's survived in a sort of more unbroken lineage. So I was a sort of live-in Aikido student for some years, and it's just completely a given for any Japanese teacher or anyone trained by the Japanese that you are training character. And there's certain, like for example, I was in Tokyo at the home dojo of Aikido, and there's old guys who get up for the 6:30 a.m. class every weekday, 5 days a week, and they've been doing that for decades. And it's very clear they're kind of polishing their being. That's how they would describe it, polishing or misogi, purifying. And that is absolutely commonsensical in Japanese education to the point, where every school kid does judo or kendo, or maybe if they're posh girls, they might do archery or naginata. There's certain sort of different elements within it. Um, yeah, that's just a very commonsensical idea. And I suspect the Greeks had a similar idea, but that tradition was sort of broken and then perhaps romantically reinvented in the West.
Yeah. So we really, when you get to, I think Theodosius the second, I believe the early kind of when the Byzantine Empire was, sort of its height
Mm.
and becoming more Christianized, that's where you start to see athleticism kind of declared as pagan and as a sort of anti-Christian practice, right? So a lot of gymnasia, the academy, all these things began to close down. And I would say, unfortunately, I'm a practicing Catholic, but I
Mhm.
find it a little sad that those things were kind of extinguished. But I understand the logic behind it, right? It was a form of worship as well. So you have this period where ostensibly there's nothing done, but actually the Greeks and early Byzantines did continue to perpetuate a lot of these sports, like oil wrestling, for example, in like Western Thrace, which is now that kind of part of Turkey that's on the European side, like that 5% landmass of the country. Like that's still practice. That's a very, very old, Greco-Roman style. Of course, there's like horse riding and javelin that also kind of survive. So these kind of vestiges exist. They certainly survive to an extent. Um, but I don't get the sense, at least, that a lot of that spiritedness of Greek arete, like of excellence, of physical excellence, I don't know to what extent that was really preserved very carefully once it gets into kind of like, European mainland and Europe becomes Christian and such. Um, Certainly it was rediscovered by, I think, Coubertin, the French kind of neo-Olympist
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
latter half of the 18th century. Actually, the Brit, I can't remember his name. My gosh, it's embarrassing. But there was actually a British fellow who I think either predates Coubertin or was around the same time. And he actually in England, I mean, he was actually the person who really did spearhead what we now consider as the Olympics. I think he had a lot of conversations with Coubertin. But unfortunately, Coubertin I think he was of noble descent. I just think he had more money and so probably just more promotional things. So he's kind of known as that, but actually I think in England was really where you see that resurrected. And of course that comes into, muscular Christianity and sort of within Anglicanism and Methodism and Presbyterianism.
Mhm.
Um, but it wasn't necessarily have those Christian roots. And you start to see the rise of health and fitness clubs. Eugene Sandow, for example, the Prussian Jewish bodybuilder, obviously bases himself in London. The first bodybuilding show is hosted there in the 1890s. A young American named Sam White, the second, I think, also wins, and he becomes the model and inspiration for a lot of Rodin's sculptures.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so you start to see this appreciation towards muscular athleticism within the contemporary art scene in Europe, because prior to that, it was just simply like these kind of very sinewy but very skinny kind of models, and they would be contorted in different ways that seemed awkward. And so that ethic, that athletic spirit that Coubertin and others sort of brought in became very, focused on the body. And you also have people like Henri de Monterland, a very famous Parisian novelist in the early 20th century. He himself, sort of a lapsed Catholic, but he said, look, there's something about doing sports and training and discipline and this character development that is spiritual. It is something that does train you in a way that's just much goes more beyond, far beyond, muscular development and athletic potential. There's something about character that's there. So I think a lot of those traits that Socrates and Plato had stamped with physical training,
Mhm.
a lot of those very, very easily found themselves resurrected within kind of like the Anglo-French, world of modern fitness and training,
Yep,
in
yep, for
particular,
sure.
yeah, of
I
that
think
sort.
it found sort of fertile ground in the British public schools, which are what you guys would call private schools. There's a saying that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton, i.e.,
Oh, that's great. Wow.
yeah, the sort of character development of the British officer class came from the games that were played in the school. So Eton, is a posh school that, a lot of kind of ruling kind of class people come from.
Mm.
And, this idea was very much in British culture and has sadly been sort of lost in British sports that, existed in things like the scouting movement would be another reemergence of that. And the Germans had sort of their movements in the 19th century of sort of the very sort of outdoorsy, and some of them kind of went down the hippie route of nakedness and free love, and some of them went down the really kind of far right route. So they went in two very different
Oh,
directions
it's
in
funny.
Germany. It's really fascinating. Let's come back to Christianity. So I could say cultural Christian, Catholic background, mystical Christian sympathies, let's say.
Sure.
So I'm quite sympathetic towards it. And tends to get quite a bad name as a sort of antibody. And some of that you can see historically. And it's sort of surprising in a way, because if we think of Jesus as an embodiment of God, like the entire religion is founded on a making of flesh that seems to be quite
Mm.
central. So yeah, I'm always quite surprised in a way that there's such strong antibody leanings in some areas, at least, of Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, this is, and I think in Catholicism in particular, and well, I don't know if I'll offend anybody. If there's any hardcore Protestant listeners, then I probably will. But there was something about the Reformation that really took away the kind of incarnateness of Christianity, right? I mean, the fact that the crucifix, right, was beginning to drop, even from sort of high church Anglicans, Lutherans. There was this idea that the body is just this awful thing, and that slowly became kind of seen in like the Puritans, for example, the kind of Baptist movement that began to migrate from England and the Netherlands and Germany as well into states like Pennsylvania and other parts of North America. But for Catholicism, it always kind of stood athwart those sort of antibody tendencies. I mean, if you think about um, Saint Dominic, for example, and Saint Thomas Aquinas, and you hear about the Albigensian heresies and the heresies against the Gnostics, for example, right?
Mhm.
This was to proclaim that, yeah, I mean, the body is not the soul for sure, but it's important. It's important when you pray the rosary, you're praying for, you're praying along with, Our Lady Mary, and you're praying for the kind of the earthly ministry of Christ, the crucifixion, the resurrection. You're thinking about all these kind of incarnate miracles that were happening around him, and I think that was a very strong cultural stamp of Catholic. When we were all, well, I'm not European, but you know, understand, like back in Europe, when I guess my family was, we were all kind of united along with Catholicism, with all of its, you know, institutional problems. Um, but that was really important for that incarnate aspect, that the body should be, as St.
Yeah.
Paul says, like, you know, the temple of the Holy Spirit. And I think once you get into this highly secularized, medicalized understanding of the body just becomes a hunk of meat, right? You poke at it, you prod at it, you cut it open, you do all these things. I'm not against medical science. I think it's great. At the same token, it 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 begins to, Mark, I think it begins to kind of lose some of that soulful character development, right? That we were just
Yeah.
talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so go ahead, please.
I think there was actually a delineation where the church kind of said, okay, to science, you deal with the body, we deal with the soul. This is the physical, this is your territory, so it's not the soul now. So I thought that was a historical incident that happened. And the other one was actually, even in Spanish, for example, this is the embodiment podcast. The word embodiment sounds religious in certain European languages. Its primary connotation is religious. So, for
Hmm,
example, I think some of my Spanish students, the word is too religious sounding to use. So they use the English word embodiment instead, which I thought was fascinating.
interesting. What do they say in Spanish? Do you know?
Is it encantación, something like that? It means
Oh, interesting.
but
Huh.
in theology, as I understand it, the word embodiment is used in a particular Christian context that might be different from most listeners. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, here's what I'd like to come back to actually, this idea of developing virtue. So I upset a lot of people on the internet yesterday, which is, the internet is how it is. It's pretty normal. People are easily triggered in the sensitive times we live in. And I triggered them by
Sure.
saying, as an employer, when I see a candidate for a job who's physically fit, I make certain informed guesses, not for certain, but informed guesses about their virtues. And while it doesn't tell me they have all the virtues, it tells me they can work hard, tells me that they probably have discipline, tells me they can apply themselves intelligently, that they can sort of deal with pain and difficulty, and also just things like they're less likely to have sick days and things like that. But what people really objected to was this Greek idea that their virtue was embodied. And of course, different people have different starting places and you can't always see fitness, blah, 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 blah. But the basic fact remains. And that was very, very upsetting to a lot of people. The idea that physical fitness could develop virtue and could be one, though not the only judge of virtue. There's other things. And, for example, I've got the single mum who gets to the gym once a week. I've got more respect for than who's manages to make it despite all her difficulties. And that seemed to be difficult for people to understand. Whereas for me, it was just common sense. Well, of course, it builds certain virtues, working out regularly. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, well, since you're speaking to an American and I'm unfortunately habit, I love my country, but it's also the fattest country. It's the country that tends to have a lot of very preventable diseases, diabetes being one, type 2. Yeah, I think that it goes beyond even just sort of like medically being healthy. I think that there's something visually and very direct and very abrasive and visceral about, seeing someone who's obviously out of shape. And I think as a species, we just immediately judge. I don't think it's possible for us to have a neutral posture. Even the most, liberal, politically correct person is going to have a millisecond in their head. We're like,
Mm,
not sure that's healthy, right? Like there's just something about that. And I don't know the evolutionary psychology behind it. It could be a mating thing. It could be an aggression thing to see who's weaker or stronger. Um, but I've noticed, at least in the American context about this, is sort of a paradox, right? You have like the fattest country in the world. You also have the country that's most obsessed about fitness too, and it's this
yes.
multi-billion-dollar industry. So it's this very, it's the place where bodybuilding really took off. I mean, it was born in England, and which is great, but it definitely certainly took off and commercialized itself in the United States and California. At the same token, yeah, you've got the land of fast food. You've got the land of an extremely sedentary lifestyle. And it is a constant struggle, I think, between these two forces. Where on one hand, yeah, you do want people to be in shape. You want a healthy country. You want people to become firefighters and cops and serve in the military. And you want grandma to not die as quickly because of her obesity. I mean, it's hard to say these things right? It's hard to say these things without sounding like fat phobic, right? Um,
Yeah, I mean, you can say them here to me, and
oh
obviously
yeah,
people are
no,
listening,
it's
but it's
oh yeah, no, I mean it's just in general, it's hard to kind of relate the ethics of why that's so important to people, right? I mean, it's like for example, in the Bible Belt in America, like the
mhm, mhm.
mostly Protestant South, great people love it. The food is horrendously unhealthy,
Yeah,
and it's just these morbidly obese people who pack in the church pews, and part of me is like, okay, like I'm sure you're lovely people, but like, don't you think that maybe you're also not totally being correct in your theology if you weigh 350 pounds? Like, there has to be something that goes through some of their heads, and I understand it's a struggle. Lord knows I struggled with obesity at one
yeah,
point.
sure, sure. There's difficult conditions we're in, and it's it's not
Very
easy in
difficult.
the current context. And I know for some friends from poorer families who didn't grow up with good food, and don't necessarily have some awareness. There's socio-cultural stuff. I mean, maybe there's two extremes here, isn't there? If we get Aristotelian about it, that
Yeah,
on
please.
one end is sort of body positivity, it's whatever body is all good, which ignores the sort of Greek idea that actually there's a civic responsibility to be well. I mean, certainly in a country with a national health service, there's, my tax is going in a certain direction. And then it's like, well, do you actually, is there a moral responsibility? Like, I would really like to see my grandkids one day. I would like to live long enough to do that and to not die when my kids are very young and leave them fatherless. That would be a terrible thing to do morally. And if I can have some, as a percentage chance way of improving that, then morally, am I not? Is there not a moral demand for me to do that? I would say there is, to be able to help myself and my fellow man. And then on the other end of that's maybe in the middle. And then on the other end of the extreme, we have a sort of Nazi ideal of and I've seen articles saying fitness is a slippery slope into far right politics. Far right inverted commas, and the idea that sort of anyone who's physically beautiful must definitely be morally beautiful, and that clearly isn't the case because there are Olympic athletes who are terrible human beings. Um,
Oh, sure.
so we sort of know there's kind of two extremes there that don't really make sense, and there is that visceral gut reaction as well, right? Like there is something there where you go, okay, this is gross and not the best human beings can do.
Yeah, it's interesting when people bring up the so-called fascist right-wing argument. I mean, it's ironic because the inventor of the barbell modern gym equipment was a Spanish socialist. Some of the most modern advanced strength training techniques were done under Stalin and Brezhnev in the Soviet period. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a little, I don't quite like, I get it. Like you see, like, I don't know, some 1930s, Reich party type thing, and they're marching around Brandenburg Gate and they've got some svelte blonde guys walking around. Yeah, but I mean, the Soviets were much
Soviets
more
did that too.
involved.
Yeah, yeah, they did that too.
Yeah, it's just, yeah, the Soviet, I mean, look at, for example, China. I mean, look
I
at these
think
places
it's,
where,
if I
they
can
just,
just go on.
oh, no, I'm sorry. Was I
I
interrupting? I
think
didn't mean
it's
to.
historical hypervigilance. So the Nazis came to define evil in our sort of moral compass in the West, and not the Maoists or the Soviets, for example, who are just as evil by most takes. But the Nazis come to define it. So anything that looks even a little bit potentially Nazi, even in just in the aesthetic, even there's a hypervigilance from all the sort of trauma around that to defend against that is part of it. And maybe there's another piece here that what people now say far right just means your granddad's kind of centrist and my kind of center right, and that there's a growth of self-responsibility in fitness that I know if I get to the gym and I have a work ethic and I apply that, that's going to have an outcome. And that in a sort of cult world where the victim is held up almost in a kind of cult like the sacred victim, Jonathan Haidt would call it. The gym doesn't really go with that, does it? It's antagonistic to the cult of the sacred victim.
Yeah, there's a transition. I think that I went through a transition myself, being pretty far left and then kind of shirking that to be more conservative. Where I think you have this kind of right, you have this sort of cult of the structural, right? Like everything is structured. You are just sort of this pawn. You're getting tossed around in the winds of capitalism. Poor you. You could use to be in a class to overthrow the state, to overthrow an economic order, and that's it. Your agency is predetermined, and there's really not much you can do. And then right on the kind of extreme, maybe even like libertarian right, if you will, it's like, look, you're solely responsible for, everything around
Yeah,
you,
yeah, yeah.
and that's it. And I think unfortunately in modern society, right, it's a little bit of both. I mean, there are certain things you can control. For
Sure.
example, you can largely control your fitness. I mean, you can decide to do things that are better for you. And I'm sure if you live in certain areas, neighborhoods, it might be a little bit more difficult, but you still have that control versus you may not have control over, like, let's say, the taxation system. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think unfortunately when kind of left-wing journalists, and I'm thinking of like folks from the Guardian or the Washington Post here in the United States, when they got all excited about muscle, weightlifting and fascism, it's like, well, some of these people are just beginning to realize that, wow, I feel good lifting. And maybe there is some personal responsibility that allows me to feel like I have more control over myself. And I'm sure there are some within that went a little bit crazy there. But I think that unfortunately we tend to have a sort of broad strokes and brushes over people, and the assumptions of what fitness means. And within the fitness realm, for sure. I mean, even looking at ultra physical and some of the publishing, we're
Sure.
very politically heterodox. We
Yeah,
have,
great, great. I really appreciate that. In our sort of divided world, I know you're explicitly, some listeners might not understand heterodox. It means you have authors from the left and the right, essentially, right?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We have, Dan Kunitz, for example. He's, liberal, secular, lives in New York City. I'm, Catholic, traditional. But we've agreed that as long as you make a good argument, we're definitely going to consider your point of view. And so we also figured that, hey, look, I mean, the body, sure, it's the body politic. It's a very old concept. But the body doesn't belong to, you know, uh, the far right. The body does not belong to the far left. Everybody has one, and we're interested in how you use it. And it's obviously going to be colored by your political experience, your gendered experience, these experiences we have. And I personally, as an editor writer, yeah, I want to hear about it. I want to hear how you express that philosophically and sociologically and whatever other discipline you want to come up with.
Yeah, the embodiment world that I'm a part of is it swings kind of very strongly left, particularly in Germany and the US, a little bit less so in the UK, but still heavily. And it's just this is it's interesting sort of now spending more time in the fitness world. It tends to be the more counterculture embodiment world of conscious dance and yoga tends to be a bit more on the left. And now I'm finding the fitness world sort of swings a little bit more to the right. I mean, as an editor, do you find it sort of tricky to balance that, or is there some articles you go, wow, this is just too far left or too far right?
Um, no, I mean, as long as it's well written and well argued, I am fine. Even if I sit there, I'm like, this is definitely not what I believe. Um, I think because we sometimes you get a little bit more on the right wing. Dan has a good spirit about it, and he says, "Oh, I love publishing things I don't disagree, agree with." So
Nice.
he's we we've had one fellow friend of mine who is a yogi. He's very involved in that. He's very devout Buddhist. And it was interesting reading his article he put for us. I think it was back in the fall, maybe. Um, and so that was a whole new world, like the whole kind of somatic practices and things of that nature. I just don't really know about. But I think in fitness in general, yeah, I mean, it's evenly divided between the kind of, softer Los Angeles wellness scene, right? Orange County, like herbal supplements, everything. And then you get to the kind of like, Ohio, big fat dude, strong as hell in his basement, lifting some rusty weights, like it definitely, there's definitely those two sides. And I personally welcome both. Again, as long as it's good writing, as long as it's well argued, sure, let's have a debate.
Yeah, well, credit to you. I've been around some civil wars, and I really don't recommend it. We like our cousins and across the sea, even if you're a bit mad sometimes. And I really don't want to see you guys kind of going at each other too hard. And it seems on the edge of that sometimes currently. So yeah, glad to hear that. Hmm.
I had a question mark. I mean,
Yeah.
what do you think? Why do you think the embodiment movement within the English or British context differs a little bit politically than, say, like, I don't know, continental Europe? I mean, what you kind of mentioned, there's a bit of a difference. I'm just curious to know what that might be.
Well, obviously, Germany is even more hyper vigilant towards kind of anything far right. And Berlin in particular has always been a liberal hub, actually, all through last century as well, was always a super liberal hub. Like, Hitler hated Berlin. So there's that. And I think generally, though, we tend to be a bit less extreme in our politics. Like I was with a friend last night who was we were disagreeing on politics, but very good-heartedly and sort of joking and smiling. And then just a few days ago, I had an American guest on who was in the American university system, meditation teacher, and I challenged her on something that was like a super liberal bias she was putting forward, that I regarded as political bias that she was passing off as science. And she was shocked. And it was clear to me she had never heard anyone intelligently challenge her kind of liberal views, which wasn't the case with the friend of mine I was hanging out with last night. It seems in the States people just talk to each other less across that political divide, and it is more extreme. Like we don't have a religious right in the same way here. And the left is a little bit more trade uniony and a bit less woke, though it depends on the generation. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there if you want to, but yeah, you're cool.
Yeah, I spent about 6 months in Leeds as a student. This was
Cool.
back in 2004.
That's where I studied.
Oh, no kidding. Oh, that's great. Yeah, no, I liked it. I like North England. Yorkshire was beautiful. What I really something that was both a shock as well as kind of a pleasure was well, first of all, the sarcasm was entertaining.
Yeah.
But there was this kind of bluntness in English political discourse, which I think would definitely be a little bit rough, I think, for the very strict ideological confines of American political discourse. So I did appreciate the fact that you would have, Tories in a classroom, and then you'd have probably more labor being at university.
Mhm.
And, they're able to just maybe, kind of very calm way, maybe a little bit excited at times, but really put forth their ideas where, and that was true even when I was in university. But I mean, today, I think it's virtually impossible in the American context to do that. So I feel like whenever I pay attention to some British outlets, and I pay attention to quite a few, whether it's The Guardian or Unheard or
Mm.
um, the whole Roger Scruton crew out there, Common Sense,
Yeah.
I just like the vigor of and the playfulness of British political discourse that for us it's just we just scream. So
Yeah.
it's
Humor's
sort
always
of
been
nice
part
to,
of it.
yeah. So
Yes.
I just find that interesting.
Great. And I want to come back to character development and virtue development through the body. Whether people are left or right, I think we all need this. Is certainly, Aikido, for example, really sorted me out and helped me get sober and helped me a lot as a young man. I definitely wouldn't be where I am today without Aikido. So, there's lots of ways to do it. I think weightlifting is a great way in that it's accessible to young people in the West. It's the most popular kind of practice, as it were, the gym. How would you optimize a weight training or gym routine for character development? If you were the headmaster of Hogwarts and you were the PE teacher, sorry, of Hogwarts, and you wanted to kind of give a physical ed program that was in the sort of Japanese or Greek spirit of character development, what might that look like?
At a very high level, and this might be a little bit too abstract for teenagers, it might even be too abstract for me. There's a difference between creating yourself and discovering yourself. In the West today, we have this idea of creating ourselves,
Hmm.
creating whatever we want of ourselves. The historic, proper, or Hellenic, whatever, even Christian notion is actually you discover yourself. You're part of this larger narrative that you discover. You don't create, right? We don't create ourselves, we are born. Um, and so I think that's important because in some ways, working out is it plays along the same kind of lines of logic. When you're working out, you're in the process of shedding unwanted fat. You're in the process of engorging and enlarging your muscle fibers. You're becoming more, elastic in certain areas where you might have been stiff. You're kind of discovering your body in that process, and it's very, as you know, Mark, it's an extremely rewarding and sometimes, it can be frustrating, adventure, I guess, if you want to call it that. And so I put the emphasis more on discovery as a Greek, and they have a beautiful term called aletheia.
Ah,
Aletheia is used in the New Testament, the book of Matthew. It's Koine Greek. It's often translated in English poorly as the truth. So Christ says, like, I am the aletheia, I am the truth. Actually, what that means in Greek is I am the unhiddenness. In other words, aletheia refers to a process by which you get to the truth. That is, you make things that are hidden and you bring them more into the obviousness of light and logic. And I think that's beautiful when we use that word because isn't that what working out is? It's the process of building of creating or building this body. I shouldn't say create because I just arguing against that. It's a process of discovering your body and the genetic potential that it has. And so I guess I would start from there, like kids, guys, like we're discovering our bodies, we're discovering what we're capable of. We're in some ways we're trying to exceed or match the expectations of all these genetics and this family of genetics that we've inherited quite unselfishly from the past. And in some ways, to get maybe a little bit more loosey goosey spiritual, it's like, look, what your ancestors are kind of demanding an answer. Like, what are you going to do with these genetics that you now have, that we've now labored on and improved for, over, millennia and millennia of life? And if they haven't fallen asleep at that speech, then I would start to say that they should start kind of
Mhm.
incorporating these sorts of practices by getting their relative strength, push-ups, pull-ups, developing that, and then eventually going on to absolute strength and really testing their limits with weights and lifting and sprinting and that kind of sort.
Lovely. I mean, I think we have quite a few neo-pagan listeners who will quite like that kind of ancestorial calling frame. Yeah, that's quite a nice one. We have a sort of a mixture of Buddhist listeners and neo-pagan listeners. I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, obviously it's a mindfulness practice. It's one of the, it's enforced mindfulness. You know, you can't not be present to your body while hitting weight hard. Um, Obviously, we've got Dorian Yates in the UK, so that tradition of sort of failure training, the extreme training. Obviously, with safety, I think there's something in that. There's something about the maybe this brings in Mishima as well, the existential challenge of squatting twice your body weight, or bench pressing your body weight. There's an existential challenge there, which I think is wonderfully refreshing at the very least, and potentially way more profound if you engage with the kind of emotional, philosophical element of doing that.
I mean, well, first of all, Dorian Yates is like my favorite. I also his training partner. I don't know who the heck that guy was. I want that training partner.
I
He's
just
just like,
listen to him, man. When I'm in the gym, I put blood and guts on it.
yeah,
The
exactly. He's like,
energy of it, the
I
energy
want
of it.
some like Brummy accent yelling at me. Come on, it's like I want that. Like where the hell's my training partner? I love my training partner. He's a good guy, Blaine. But yeah, no, yeah, I think the process of discovery is kind of the master narrative, and I think within that, certainly you can talk about discipline. Why it's better to withhold yourself from eating certain things, practicing kind of a form of like semi or para abstinence when it comes to food or certain lifestyles. It's very hard if you don't develop those things in childhood, as an adult, which I kind of, skipped over a little bit. Yeah, it does become harder but if you develop them as a child, you have these incredible tools that you can summon, that other people will pay others thousands of dollars just to learn, right? It's kind of, it's wild when you think about that. And so, yeah, that the character part I think can go into a lot of different directions, even if you're not, you know, a first century, proto Spartan or something like that, and you're defending your village or whatever. I might have gotten the history mixed up there, but even if you're not going to be throwing your body against, an army that's
Sure,
invading,
sure.
certainly there are other areas that you can use and express courage and all these things in your flesh.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting you used a nice word there. It wasn't the Buddhist concept would be renunciation. Just eludes me now what you called it. That weightlifting looks like it's about sort of pushing hard, and there is that, accessing energy and have, discipline, of course, turning up. In sort of embodiment terms, a lot of it's about what we would call self-regulation. That's a lot of
Mm.
in terms of nervous system regulation. But then there's also abstinence, which is not very trendy, but it's actually a part of every single spiritual tradition, from Buddhist monks who only eat twice a day to Lent to Ramadan. And it's interesting that as you hit the gym more, at first you have to sort of push yourself to go. And my experience is most people who are serious, and I heard Mike Israel talk about this morning, who we've got coming on the show, which is you end up actually having to sort of restrain yourself from not doing another set or from not going every single day. And you end up working much more on your kind of sleep and rest and the sort of yin side of things, kind of, as well as abstinence. Like, I want to cut right now, which is a classic abstinence practice, really. These things, naturally occur, or even brahmacharya in the Hindu tradition. I would deliberately not have sex in the morning before the gym because I need the energy. Like, these are classical renunciation practices, really.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think we just have a very thoroughly secularized culture where we've just forgotten, right, what that means. I mean, even Lent today. I mean, what is Lent in the modern Catholic context, America is like, okay, I'm not going to eat chocolate. Like it's a little pathetic, you know.
Yeah, the
It's
Muslims are still hardcore. You could learn from the Muslims if you want to see how to do things.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
I lived in Turkey for, on and off for almost 4 years
Okay.
doing research. So yeah, I mean, when it comes to Ramadan, it was I mean, it was really fascinating and very humbling to see that. Yeah, I mean, abstinence, I think that might be a very kind of American, has a religious connotation to it, but I think that's what it is though. And I agree too. It's like, you know, so much of your physique and progress is really built on what you're doing outside the gym, which is probably the most frustrating part because it's not fun.
Right.
Um, sleep, you know, and sleep is something that I struggle with, like a lot of people. You know, dieting is tough. And I try to push myself with intermittent fasting, and I try to go without food for a couple days, and
Yep.
you know, just to test myself, just to kind of see what I can do. It's in some ways it's also a character exercise. In some ways, it's just almost kind of in a weird way fun. I don't know. Um, just the challenge.
Nice, nice. Fun fact on Lent. So it used to be that Christians wouldn't eat meat on a Friday. I think it was a Friday, or was it a Sunday?
Yeah, on Friday, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and but they decided that beaver was a fish. So that's why there's no beavers in the UK because they ate them all. 'Cause
That's funny. That's oh my God, that's a great story. I have to
there's
remember
a, there's a few
that.
coming back. There's a few coming back now, but I thought that was how people like to bend the rules. They always have done throughout history. Um,
Beaver.
one thing you'll yeah you can't eat beaver on a Sunday. One thing you'll often hear people say, like who are just even just fitness bros, low level influencers, they'll say, "Hey, the gym builds confidence." I think we can look at that a little bit deeper. It's like, yes, you feel good because you look a certain way, but there's also a direct somatic kind of confidence and just extending your spine and the kind of biochemicals that come with lifting. What's your take on confidence, almost in inverted commas, as it's often said, like, yeah, this is one of the best things about the gym. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an immediate byproduct, especially if you've maintained that for several months. You've just seen that transformation. I think, unfortunately, it gets in, at least in the American commercialized context, very toxic very quickly because that confidence soon becomes arrogance. It becomes self-absorbed. I mean,
Yeah.
you see that with some of these. You know, I'm like I said, I'm an older guy. I don't inhabit TikTok or anything like that, or I go on Instagram is really my limitation. But when I see kind of like the Gen Z types out there, some of whom are incredibly impressive, but I can see especially that some of them just go from like confidence to super egoistic attitudes. So I think yes, confidence is there. I think it's good. I don't have much to say about it. I'm more concerned about the toxic effect of always thinking that you're the shit, right? And
Right, right.
um,
Yeah.
that to me is no longer character. It's sort of in some ways degenerating the virtue of itself. It's the same reason why some guys will just start hitting exogenous hormones, right? It's because now they feel like, well, I
Yeah.
have to keep up appearances. Like, well, that's a deconstruction of one's character. So I think confidence is important, but oh man, in the United States and the gym culture here, it can quickly go out the door, you know?
Yeah, let's go there then. So even though I'm a big fan of the gym and weights and working out, there is a trap of narcissism, right? Like again, Aristotle maybe is the sort of golden middle here is probably the best thing, but there is this trap of narcissism, the selfie culture, the for listeners, exogenous hormones, you mean steroids. So the steroid culture, which for example in Australia, it's totally normal for young men to take steroids. I know in my gym, I'd say half the guys are on steroids. I'm not. I'm completely natural, and it will probably remain that way unless I take TRT as I get older. Um, there is this sort of trap of narcissism. It seems like the culture goes one of two ways. Either the body is sort of as just a meat wagon, a brain taxi, it doesn't matter at all. The body's just an object, or it's this sort of excessive pride, which is it's still a body objectification, really. It's still my body as almost like a status symbol or something like that, isn't it? Like, how can we avoid that while embracing strength training?
I mean, yeah, it's that's a hard one to square. I think that the why I kind of go back to Greeks, and it seems like the Japanese have something similarly beautiful, is that there is this idea of moderation and temperance. And of course, you say yourself you're a moderate, people think it's kind of pathetic, right? Like, who cares about moderation? You got to go extreme. But I think in this, it's like the whole person, right? It's the character development of the soul. It's the pursuit of wisdom and knowledge and virtue. It's the pursuit, while the wild chasing of the forms, which are, ideals of beauty that we can never get to, but we still have it in our mind of what it is, right? It's like those are kind of noble sort of pursuits in many ways. And I think the body can sort of enflesh those. It becomes sort of somatically expressed. Um, when we're no longer chasing the good, as Plato would say, we're no longer chasing holiness, as maybe Christ would say or the Christian would say. Then, in some ways, ironically, the Jim Bro pursuit of the ultimate body becomes another slovenly, body centric vice. It becomes just as bad as what Plato would complain about is just having wild sex all the time, or the overconsumption of alcohol or overconsumption of food. It just the soul once more is dragged by the nose by the body's demands. And so I think that in some ways having that sense of moderation is important. I guess I'm actually curious to hear what you think, Mark. I sometimes have a struggle because I don't do as much powerlifting as I did um, a couple of years ago. I still obviously lift and such, but um, in order to really build that body, though, right, it is a paradox because you do actually have to sacrifice a lot, right? You do have to like really hit the gym hard. You do have to like get that sleep. You do have to tighten up the nutrition. And sometimes it comes at the cost of socializing or
Yeah,
helping
yeah.
people. So I find that I personally struggle with that. And I understand what the Greeks are saying, but sometimes I'm like, yeah, but man, Plato, like, don't you want to have like this jack, don't you want to get like huge and stuff? So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, Plato means broad shoulders, so he was probably already huge. Yeah, he's probably already jacked. And
Yeah,
Christ,
exactly.
Christ, Christ was a carpenter before power tools and was probably slightly malnourished, so he probably had a very low body fat and a pretty strong physique.
Right, right.
In the Italian churches, actually, they always portray the disciples as pretty jacked in a lot of the Italian
Yeah,
church.
yeah,
Surprised me
that's
actually
true.
when I was there this year. I was like, wow, these guys are jacked, you know. Yeah, I mean, for me, if I spent 3 years, last 3 years, pretty intensely weightlifting, but it was not my work until recently. It was just a hobby, and I made a point of sort of not ever really posting pictures, and it was just for me. And it's interesting. I'm going to have like my first photo shoot in the gym of my life in a week's time, and part of me is concerned that that could lead me towards more externally facing kind of way of looking at what I do in the gym rather than previously it's
Hmm.
been much more, to avoid depression and to feel good and to work on my virtues. And I guess another piece that I see though is, and I've seen this with martial arts too, people join martial arts to fight and then later on they realize it makes them a better person. And there's a natural movement of motivations. And if a young guy's like, hey, I want to get a girlfriend, or a young girl's like, hey, I want to get a tight booty and I'm going to go to the gym, maybe that's fine as they step in. And maybe it's just developing a gym culture where there is a potential higher calling if people want it. And not everyone's going to take that, right? Like for me, I'd love
Hmm.
to enrich, be part of enriching gym culture. So it's an option for those who want it. And I've seen this time and time again, people naturally, like, they start meditating just for a bit of, to get better at their city job as a banker and then to relieve stress. And then, it gradually evolves into something a bit more profound. So, yeah, I think that's possible in gym culture as long as there's enough podcasts like this ones that people can grab hold of and go, oh, there is something more possible. And then they can go down that path if they want to.
Yeah. And I think too, it comes with a sense of maybe age and maturity. When you're 20 or something like that, you may, I mean, I'm sure there are very enlightened 20-year-olds. I wasn't. But perhaps there are ones who do have that sense of balance and the kind of the bigger abstract intellectual virtuous picture. But I do feel that largely in secular Western culture in America, it's looking good for the opposite sex or same sex, whatever floats your boat, I suppose. And and yeah, that's really where it starts. And sometimes it ends there. And it's a shame because that's where I think you get a lot of, more malevolent influences like steroid use. That you'd said
Yeah.
steroids, obviously, right,
Yeah.
nominally illegal in the United States, but that obviously has not stopped anybody from taking them, especially if you have your friend as a veterinarian, then you've got access to all sorts of crazy stuff. I don't use them, but I know people do. Um, and yeah, it's I think the hormone the steroid issue is a big fault within the fitness industry, and certainly it's one for those who are more body positive on the kind of negative body positive side, can certainly use as ammunition, I think, against the more toxic contours of, you know, fitness culture in the States and other places.
Yeah, I think what a lot of guys don't realize as well is that most women are actually surprisingly deep. I sent my girlfriend a picture of my arms, and she said, "That's nice, Mark. You have lovely arms, yes, but you do realize I like you for your personality."
Oh,
And
that's it's a keeper. It's a keeper.
like, okay, women aren't that shallow. That's a good thing, you know. So maybe as we're coming to starting to move towards close here, what
Sure.
about the sort of the other side of this? So we have the narcissism, that's there in the gym. And we have the people who, you know, are just rocking up and doing their best, and it's helping them in a small way to feel confident and healthy, or it's their, you know, the single mom's, you know, 1 hour a week where she gets stress relief and it's super good for her mental health. And then the other thing given that that's most people in the gym, actually, I don't, certainly in the UK, most people in the gym are just normal, decent people doing their thing. They're not crazy narcissist influencers on Instagram. There's very few of those. Given that, I'm surprised how much resentment it draws. So as I've been more public about and linking my kind of embodiment work and philosophical musings to the gym in the last few months, I've been quite surprised about the sort of level of resentment that people often resent people who go to the gym, and I'm trying to figure out why. Is it that it sort of highlights the fact that they're not doing that? Is it you think you're better than me? What do you think that sort of maybe this brings Nietzsche in and kind of resent them all? Like why are people so nasty about people who go to the gym who aren't going to the gym? What's that about?
I mean, honestly, it's like the ponderance of a lifetime. I think it's a few things. You know, some people. I think the least possible one is this like weird class resentment, like, you know, in the Victorian period. Oh, folks who are muscle bound, or, you know, just a bunch of working class slob types, and of course they're big and all that stuff. I mean, there might be a little bit of that, or like this sort of, you know, a
Mm,
dumb jock kind of mentality that we have, you know, in the States. You know, big and muscular, but just can barely speak or sounds like a Neanderthal. You know, there's probably a little bit of that. There's a sense that the body doesn't have any kind of intellectual or virtuous output to it, that it's not the same as sitting down with a book of calculus, for example, and just or pondering Newtonian
it's a
physics,
waste
right?
of time if you're at the gym. You should be learning a language or, you know, helping
Right.
children in Africa. And the people who say that, though, they aren't learning a language or helping children in Africa. They're watching Netflix.
Well, that's just, yeah. Jim Wendler is a powerlifting coach, author of a big methodology used called 531, and he says, you know, something to the effect of, oh, you know, if I, you know, had all this free time, you know, I would be big and jacked just like you. He says, no, you wouldn't. He said, you know, you'd be out there in your basement playing Xbox, you know, doing nothing. It's like you're weak because you're weak, right? And I think he's right. It's like, um, it does take a lot of discipline and concentration and training to get to a certain point in one's physique, and it's a lifetime pursuit. I've had peaks and troughs in my time, injuries that set me back and things like that. And I think it's always trying to keep going further, to keep pursuing like the Socratic good or whatever you want to call it, right? It's the constant non-linear progression that we all go through with our bodies. And I think that unfortunately is never seen. We
Mm.
just see the body presented as it is right before our eyes, and ergo all of the judgments coming, you're vain, you're self-absorbed, you're probably a dumbass. You know, it's all these kinds of things that we don't see, that are these morals that are enfleshed within that process. And I think Mishima, for example, does talk about it. He says, you know, there is something about being surface level that is very profound. I mean, he kind of inverts that whole logic of surface level knowledge or surface level critique. It's like, no, there is depth to the surface. And so people don't get that when they don't work out. Yes, they'll roll their eyes and they'll tell you, oh, yeah, I get it. It's like, you know, it's really cool and it like helps you out. It's like, no, if you haven't done it, it's not going to be important. You won't realize how important it is. So I think in our society, it's, yes, there's the judgment aspect of it. Maybe there's a class attitude behind it. There's the narcissism attitude. And I think that's always been there. When you look, for example, at Socrates and Xenophon,
Mm.
Xenophon's memorabilia. Sorry, Xenophon was a student of Socrates, and memorabilia. He talks about Epigenes, who's one of you know, the acolytes that are following Socrates as he wanders about Athens and talks. And, he looks at this kid who probably is a little bit slovenly looking, and he says, it'd do you some good if you took care of your body. And what does the guy say? He rolls his eyes like, well, I mean, it's not like I'm an athlete, Socrates. And he says, no, never mind that. It's like there's something noble in trying to build your body in youth that you're not doing. And so I think for me, that putting the ethics, and I'm writing a book about this, hopefully to be published soon. Putting the body back as a proper ethical subject is something that we desperately need in the United States, and I'm sure parts of Europe as well, because we've just lost it now. It's become this vain, vice-ridden pursuit that's so unfortunate and so anti-intellectual too, I might add.
Wonderful. And just for listeners, Mishima wrote a book called Sun and Steel, which is freely available on YouTube now, actually, as an audio book, which is one of the deeper books you could ever read on weight training. And got this slightly crazy Japanese Budo, interesting character, certainly. So I'd recommend that. Wow, we're almost on the hour here, Joe. I mean, I felt like this is probably one of the deeper conversations about strength training and weightlifting that's people will find on the internet, actually. So it's been a delight for me.
Oh no, Mark. I mean, this is all due to you. No, I enjoy talking about it. I rarely, even though I kind of live in that world of editing and publishing, I don't have a lot of conversations about it. So this is actually quite refreshing, and I felt like I've learned a lot from you. I'll have to look more into sort of Japanese understandings of Budo now.
Joe, real pleasure. Where can people find you on the internet? Just want to plug your stuff and your social media.
No, I appreciate it, Mark. So the main site is ultraphysical.us. I have an Instagram handle. It's like 2_ultraphysical. That's really where most of, I'd say, my more intelligently argued articles are. I also have a website, but I rarely use it. But so ultraphysical.us, it's on a Substack. It's free subscriptions. Of course, we always encourage donations, but hey, whatever floats your boat. I'm fine either way. I'm just thankful people read it and, get something out of it.
Joe, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Mark. Take care now.